Dennis Martin was 6 years old when he disappeared into thin air in the Great Smoky Mountains. Within minutes of vanishing, hundreds of searchers flooded the forest. Bloodhounds arrived. German shepherds trained to find missing people were brought in. But here's what nobody can explain. Every single search dog refused to track him. Not one, not two, all of them. These aren't pets afraid of thunder. These are professional tracking animals that locate people in collapsed buildings, war zones, and disaster sites. Yet they cowered, whined, and flat out refused to follow Dennis Martin's trail. What did those dogs sense that humans couldn't? What was out there in those mountains that made trained animals choose terror over doing their job? This isn't folklore. This happened in 1969, and what the search teams found instead of Dennis will make you question everything you thought you knew about America's national parks. The answer is going to disturb you because this case breaks every rule of how missing person searches work. Before we get into what actually happened to Dennis, you need to understand something critical about search dogs. These animals don't just randomly decide to quit. A properly trained search dog will track through rain, snow, across rivers, through brambles. They've located survivors in collapsed buildings in Mexico City. They found lost hikers in Alaska's wilderness. Some have tracked human scent across distances that seem impossible. So when a search dog refuses to work, handlers know something is catastrophically wrong with the situation. But in Dennis Martin's case, it wasn't just one dog having an off day. It was all of them. Multiple dogs from different units, different handlers, different training backgrounds. They all exhibited the same behavior, extreme reluctance bordering on panic. And the few dogs that did attempt to follow the scent, they led searchers to places that made absolutely no sense. We're talking geographic impossibilities for a 6-year-old child. Now, Father's Day weekend 1969 probably started like any other camping trip for the Martin family. Dennis, his brother, his father, and his grandfather packed up and headed to Spencefield in the Great Smoky Mountains. Beautiful area. Popular camping spot. Thousands of families visit without incident every single year. The Martins had no reason to think this trip would be any different. But what happened next would become one of the most disturbing disappearances in National Park Service history. Here's how it went down, and pay attention because the timeline is crucial. Dennis and his brother were playing a game with some other kids at the campsite. Standard kid stuff. They decided to hide behind some bushes to jump out and scare the adults. The boys split up to approach from different directions. Dennis went behind one set of bushes. His brother went behind another. The plan was simple. Wait a few seconds, then jump out. Dennis's brother jumped out. The adults laughed. Everyone looked around for Dennis to make his entrance. Except Dennis never came out from behind his bush. His father called for him. Nothing. They walked over to where Dennis had run. He wasn't there. Now, the bushes Dennis went behind were roughly 50 feet from where his family stood. 50 feet. That's about half a basketball court. His father lost sight of him for maybe 45 seconds, 90 seconds maximum. In that impossibly brief window, Dennis Martin completely vanished. The family searched immediately. They're shouting Dennis's name, spreading out, checking behind trees and rocks. Nothing. They alert other campers. Within 30 minutes, you've got dozens of people combing the area. Park rangers arrive. Within hours, this becomes one of the largest search operations the National Park Service had ever conducted at that time. We're talking over 1,400 searchers, military personnel, FBI agents, civilian volunteers, helicopters. It was massive. And this is where things get weird in a way that still bothers search and rescue professionals today. The search dogs arrived within the first 24 hours, which is exactly what you want in a missing child case. Fresh scent, minimal contamination, good weather conditions. These dogs should have locked on to Dennis's trail immediately. Instead, They acted like they'd encountered something profoundly wrong. Handlers reported the dogs whining, backing away, refusing to follow scent trails that they clearly could detect. Some dogs would start following a trail, then stop abruptly and refuse to continue. One handler, whose dog refused to work, said something that stuck with investigators. "My dog acts like this when he smells death, but won't approach it. Except there's no body here." Another handler reported their dog tracked Dennis's scent to a spot, then began tracking backward, as if whatever trail existed was somehow moving in the wrong direction. That shouldn't be possible. Scent doesn't work that way. Yet multiple dogs exhibited this exact behavior. Now here's where the Dennis Martin case stops being just tragic and becomes genuinely mysterious. The searchers found Dennis's tracks initially, child-sized shoe prints in the soft ground. They led away from the campsite in a direction that made sense given the terrain. A 6-year-old running playfully would logically go that way. But then the footprints just stopped. Not gradually. Not like he climbed on a rock or reached hard ground. They just ended as if Dennis had been lifted into the air mid-stride. Searchers found a small scrap of Dennis's red shirt caught on a bush. The fabric was torn in a way that suggested it had been ripped off violently. But the bush it was found on was nearly 11 miles from where Dennis disappeared. 11 miles of some of the roughest terrain in the Smokies. Grown men with hiking experience took 6 hours to reach that location from the campsite. Yet somehow, within the first day or two of his disappearance, Dennis's shirt material ended up there. A 6-year-old boy in canvas sneakers with no supplies crossed 11 miles of mountains. The math doesn't work. The timeline doesn't work. Nothing about it works. But it gets stranger. Multiple search parties reported hearing a child's crying in the distance. Not just one group. Several groups at different times reported hearing what sounded like a young boy crying for help. The sounds always came from areas that had just been thoroughly searched. Teams would rush toward the sound. They'd find nothing. No tracks, no disturbances. No Dennis. Then hours later, a different team miles away would report hearing the exact same thing. One of the most experienced rangers on that search, a man who'd been involved in dozens of missing persons cases, went on record saying he'd never encountered anything like it. He said the sound seemed to move faster than any child could move through that terrain. He described it as wrong somehow, like it was meant to be heard but not found. That's a direct quote from his official report. Park rangers don't usually put subjective feelings like that in official documentation unless something genuinely rattled them. And then there's the witness that Park Service officials really didn't want to talk about. On the same day Dennis disappeared, 2 different families camping in the area reported seeing something unusual. A hairy man, or an ape-like figure, moving quickly through the trees, carrying what might have been a child. Both reports came from credible witnesses. One was a former military officer. The other was a schoolteacher. Neither knew each other. Both described essentially the same thing. Something large, covered in hair, moving on 2 legs through the forest at a speed that seemed impossible, with what looked like a small body slung over its shoulder. The Park Service investigated these reports. They interviewed both families separately. The descriptions matched too closely to dismiss outright, but officially acknowledging the reports would have caused panic. So they were included in the files, but minimized in public statements. This created a situation where hundreds of searchers were looking for a lost boy, while a small group of investigators were quietly wondering if they should be looking for something that took him. Let's address the explanations people offer for what happened to Dennis Martin, because some make sense until you look at the details. Theory 1. Dennis simply got lost, succumbed to exposure, and his body was never found. Reasonable, right? Mountains are big. Bodies disappear. Except Dennis vanished in June. Weather was mild. Temperatures at night dropped to the 50s, which is cold for a kid in a t-shirt, but not immediately lethal. He would have had several days to be found before exposure became the primary danger. And remember, 1,400 people searched for 9 days. They covered hundreds of square miles. Dogs should have found something. Theory 2. Dennis fell and was injured, perhaps in a location that was somehow missed. But the Spencefield area where he disappeared is well mapped. There aren't hidden ravines deep enough to completely conceal a child from that many searchers. And again, the scent trail issue comes up. Even if Dennis fell into some crevice, dogs should have alerted to the location. They'd detect decomposition scent if he'd died. They detected his scent at multiple locations, but refused to track it. That's the part that breaks this theory. Theory 3, the one nobody wants to say out loud, but everyone thinks about: animal predation. Black bears are in the Smokies. Could a bear have taken Dennis? There are problems with this too. First, black bears almost never attack humans. Fatal black bear attacks on children are extraordinarily rare. Second, if a bear attacked Dennis, there would be evidence. Blood. Torn clothing scattered around. Signs of struggle. Searchers found almost nothing except that single piece of shirt 11 miles away. Bears don't carry prey 11 miles through difficult terrain. They kill, they eat, they leave remains. None of that happened here. So that brings us to the explanation that makes people uncomfortable. Something else. Something that walks on 2 legs, is strong enough to carry a child, and moves through the forest in ways that seem almost impossible. The idea of an unknown primate living in the Smokies sounds ridiculous until you remember that the park covers over 500,000 acres of wilderness. That's almost 800 square miles of dense forest, much of it in remote areas where humans rarely go. The last comprehensive wildlife survey of the park was done decades ago. Scientists regularly find species they didn't know existed in well-studied ecosystems. Is it really impossible that something large and unidentified lives in those mountains? The Native Americans who lived in the Smoky Mountains for thousands of years before European settlement have stories about forest beings that take children. The Cherokee called them different names depending on the region, but the descriptions are consistent. Tall, hair-covered, incredibly strong, and intelligent enough to avoid sustained human contact. When European settlers arrived and started reporting similar encounters, anthropologists dismissed them as folklore. But folklore usually starts with a kernel of truth. Here's what makes the Dennis Martin case particularly unsettling. It's not unique. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park has an unusual number of missing persons cases relative to its visitor numbers. Since it became a national park in 1934, hundreds of people have disappeared there. Most are found. Some aren't, but a subset of the ones who aren't found share strange similarities with Dennis's case. Rapid disappearance despite proximity to other people. Search dogs acting strangely or refusing to track. Scent trails that make no geographic sense. Occasional sightings of unusual figures in the forest around the time of the disappearance. A researcher named David Paulides has compiled data on missing persons in national parks. His work is controversial, but the statistical patterns he's identified are hard to ignore. Children and young men vanish disproportionately. Disappearances cluster in certain geographic areas. Search dogs exhibit unusual behavior in many cases. Bodies, when found, are located in areas that were previously searched multiple times. Clothing is sometimes found intact and neatly folded far from where the person disappeared, which makes no sense if someone died of exposure. The Park Service doesn't like these patterns being discussed publicly, not because they're covering up Bigfoot sightings or anything conspiratorial, but because acknowledging unexplained elements in missing persons cases raises questions they can't answer. Imagine being a park ranger and having to tell a family, "We don't know what happened to your child." And some aspects of the case don't make sense within our current understanding of how people get lost in the wilderness. That's not an acceptable answer for grieving families or for politicians who control park budgets. But the silence creates its own problems. People who work in search and rescue, park rangers with decades of experience, law enforcement in rural areas near national parks. They all have stories that don't fit neat explanations. Stories they share quietly with each other, but rarely put in official reports. Most of these stories have common elements. Something seen briefly that didn't look quite human. Sounds that seemed wrong. Animals behaving as if a predator was near, when nothing visible could be identified as a threat. And that recurring theme of search dogs refusing to work in areas where logic says a missing person should be. You want to know the darkest part? Dennis Martin's family spent years hoping he'd wandered off and was somehow alive, maybe taken in by hikers or living rough in the forest. As the years passed, that hope faded into the grief of never knowing what happened. But occasionally, in the decades since Dennis disappeared, park visitors in the Smoky Mountains have reported hearing a voice in the deep forest calling for help, sounding like a young boy. These reports are rare. They're never confirmed. But they keep happening.